The rain came down in sheets that night, drumming against the bedroom window like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Elena Martinez sat curled on the edge of the bed, one hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, the other clutching her phone as she stared at the message that had just shattered her world into a million irreparable pieces. The blue light from the screen cast shadows across her face, illuminating the tears that streamed silently down her cheeks. She had always believed that love could survive anything, poverty, distance, even the crushing weight of disappointment, but she had never imagined it would need to survive this. The message was from an unknown number, but the words burned themselves into her memory with the permanence of a brand. Your husband has made arrangements. The transaction will occur tomorrow night. Do not resist or both you and the child will suffer. Her fingers trembled as she read it again, searching desperately for some alternative meaning, some interpretation that wouldn't destroy everything she thought she knew about the man sleeping peacefully beside her. Marcus had always been ambitious, sometimes recklessly so, but Elena had loved that about him once. She had loved his dreams of wealth and status, his determination to rise above the modest circumstances of their working-class neighborhood. When they married 3 years ago in a small ceremony attended by family and a handful of close friends, she had believed they would build their empire together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. She had worked double shifts at the hospital where she served as a nurse, coming home with aching feet and exhausted eyes. Also, Marcus could pursue his business ventures. She had believed in him when no one else did, had held him through the failures and celebrated the small victories. And when she discovered she was pregnant 4 months ago, she had seen it as the beginning of their greatest chapter, the moment when all their struggles would finally make sense. She had imagined Marcus as a father, pictured him holding their baby with those same strong hands that had held her on their wedding night, and she had felt complete in a way she never had before. But something had changed in recent months. Marcus had become distant, preoccupied, spending long hours away from home with explanations that grew increasingly vague and unsatisfying. He would return late at night smelling of expensive perfume that Elena didn't own, his phone constantly buzzing with messages he would never open in her presence. When she asked him about it, he would smile that charming smile that had first captured her heart and tell her she was being paranoid, that pregnancy hormones were making her imagine things that didn't exist. He would kiss her forehead and remind her that everything he did was for their family, for their future. And because Elena wanted so desperately to believe him, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate, she had swallowed her doubts and tried to trust. But trust, once fractured, never quite fits back together the same way. The cracks remain, and through those cracks, the truth inevitably seeps in like poison. The truth had arrived tonight in the form of that message, and with it came a flood of memories that now appeared in a completely different light. She remembered the night 2 weeks ago when Marcus had received a phone call and stepped outside to take it, speaking in low, urgent tones she couldn't quite make out. She remembered how he had insisted she stop working at the hospital, telling her it was too stressful for the baby, that she needed to rest, to stay home. At the time, she had been touched by his concern, grateful even. Now she understood it had nothing to do with concern at all. He had been isolating her, cutting her off from the outside world, from the colleagues and friends who might notice if something was wrong. She remembered the strange man who had appeared at their door a week ago, well-dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Marcus had ushered him quickly into the study and closed the door, and when Elena had asked about it later, he had dismissed it as a potential business investor, nothing she needed to worry her pretty head about. Now sitting in the darkness with rain hammering against the glass and her baby moving gently inside her, Elena understood that she had been living with a stranger. The man beside her, breathing deeply in peaceful sleep, was not the person she had married, or perhaps he had always been this person and she had simply been too blind with love to see it. The thought made her stomach turn, made her want to scream or run or both, but she did neither. Instead, she sat very still, her mind racing through possibilities and plans, through scenarios and escape routes. If the message was true and every instinct in her body told her it was, then she had less than 24 hours to figure out what to do. The bedroom door creaked open suddenly, and Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She quickly locked her phone and slipped it under her pillow, arranging her face into what she hoped was a neutral expression. Marcus stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip. He reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, a gesture that had once seemed tender but now felt like a violation. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made everything worse. He asked if she was feeling all right, if the baby was keeping her awake. Elena forced herself to nod, to smile, to play the role of the trusting wife, even as her mind screamed at her to run. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and she wondered if he could see the knowledge there, the terrible understanding that had taken root in her heart. But then he kissed her forehead and told her to get some rest, that tomorrow was going to be a big day. The words sent ice through her veins, but she managed to keep her expression neutral as he stood and walked back toward the door. After he left, Elena remained frozen on the bed for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, listening to the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway, followed by the soft click of the guest room door closing. He hadn't slept in their bedroom for the past 3 nights, claiming he didn't want to disturb her rest with his restless tossing and turning. Another lie in a web of lies so intricate she wondered how she had failed to see the pattern until now. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and in the relative quiet, Elena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the baby shifting inside her as though sensing her distress. She pulled her phone back out from under the pillow and read the message again, this time forcing herself to analyze it with the clinical detachment she had learned during her years in nursing, treating it like a symptom that needed diagnosis rather than a death sentence that needed mourning. The fact that someone had warned her meant that not everyone involved in this nightmare was complicit. Someone, somewhere in the chain of whatever horrific plan Marcus had constructed, possessed enough conscience to reach out to give her a chance. But who, and why had they chosen to warn her anonymously rather than go to the authorities themselves? The answer, Elena realized with growing dread, was probably the same reason she herself was hesitating to involve the police. Whoever had sent this message was afraid, trapped in a situation where speaking out openly would put them at risk, which meant that whatever Marcus had arranged involved people dangerous enough to inspire that kind of fear. She thought about the man in the expensive suit, tried to recall details she hadn't paid attention to at the time. He had been older, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. His shoes had been Italian leather, his watch a Rolex that probably cost more than Elena earned in a year. When he had shaken Marcus's hand, there had been something in his expression that Elena had interpreted as professional courtesy, but now understood might have been something closer to ownership. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky beneath her, and moved to the window. Outside, the street was empty and dark except for the occasional glow of streetlights reflecting off puddles. Their neighborhood was quiet, respectable, the kind of place where people minded their own business and assumed their neighbors were doing the same. No one would hear her if she screamed. No one would come running if she called for help. The realization of her isolation hit her with physical force, making her lean against the window frame for support. Marcus had been so careful, so methodical in his planning. He had convinced her to quit her job, had gradually distanced her from her social circle, had positioned himself as her sole source of support and connection to the outside world, and she had let him, had even been grateful for what she perceived as his care and protection. The depth of her own naivety made her want to weep, but she swallowed the tears and forced herself to think clearly. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Elena moved to the closet and began pulling out clothes, laying them quietly on the bed. She would need to pack light, only essentials, nothing that would slow her down or draw attention. But even as she folded a sweater and placed it in a small backpack, doubt crept in. Where exactly was she planning to go? She had perhaps $300 in her personal account, money she had saved from her last few paychecks before leaving the hospital. That might last her a week if she was careful, maybe 2 if she was desperate. And then what? She was 7 months pregnant, visibly so, which meant finding work would be nearly impossible. Shelters were overwhelmed and often unsafe. Hotels would want identification, credit cards, information that could be traced. The practical realities of escape began to close in around her like walls, narrowing her options to an increasingly claustrophobic space. She sat back down on the bed, the backpack half-packed beside her, and allowed herself a moment of complete honesty. She was terrified, not just of what Marcus had planned, but of the vast unknown that stretched before her if she ran. At least here in this house she knew the shape of the danger. Out there she would be vulnerable to 1,000 different threats, any one of which could harm her or her baby. The maternal instinct that had been growing stronger with each passing week of her pregnancy now warred with her survival instinct, creating a paralysis born of impossible choices. Stay and face whatever horror awaited her tomorrow night, or run and possibly subject herself and her child to something even worse. The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. A sound from downstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, definitely footsteps, but heavier than Marcus's, and there were 2 sets, maybe 3. Elena's blood turned to ice as she heard the front door open, heard voices speaking in low tones. She hadn't heard a knock, which meant either Marcus had been expecting visitors or someone had a key. She moved silently to the bedroom door and eased it open just enough to peer down the hallway toward the stairs. The voices grew clearer, and she recognized Marcus's smooth baritone, but there was something different in his tone now, something obsequious and eager that she had never heard before. He was speaking to someone he considered his superior, someone he was trying desperately to please. Elena pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps as she strained to hear the conversation unfolding below. A woman's voice drifted up the stairs, high-pitched and sickeningly sweet, laced with the kind of manufactured affection that made Elena's skin crawl. The woman was laughing at something Marcus had said, a tinkling sound like breaking glass, and then her words became clearer as the group apparently moved from the entryway into the living room directly beneath the bedroom. She was talking about furniture, about how this house was too small, too ordinary, how Marcus deserved so much better once everything was finalized. The way she said finalized made it sound like a business merger rather than whatever nightmare transaction they were actually discussing. Elena's hands curled into fists as she realized this had to be the mistress, the woman for whom Marcus was willing to destroy everything they had built together, the woman for whom he was willing to sell his own wife like livestock. Another voice joined the conversation, deeper and more authoritative, and Elena recognized it immediately as belonging to the silver-haired man in the expensive suit. He was addressing Marcus with the tone of someone reviewing a contract, asking about logistics and timing, about whether the merchandise would be properly prepared and compliant. The clinical language made Elena's stomach heave, and she had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from vomiting. They were talking about her as though she were an object, a commodity to be transferred from one owner to another, and Marcus was participating in this dehumanization without apparent hesitation or shame. She heard him assure the man that everything was under control, that his wife suspected nothing, that she was naive and trusting and would cause no problems whatsoever. The betrayal in those words cut deeper than anything Elena had experienced before, a pain so profound it felt almost physical, as though someone had reached inside her chest and torn out something essential. The woman spoke again, and this time her voice carried a note of impatience, almost petulance. She wanted to know when they could stop all this secrecy, when she could finally move into a proper home and be acknowledged publicly as Marcus's partner. She was tired of hiding, tired of being second, tired of waiting for him to handle his situation. The way she said that last word, dripping with contempt, made it clear that Elena and her unborn child were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to be removed. Marcus's response was soothing, placating, promising that by this time tomorrow everything would be resolved, and they could begin their new life together. He spoke of the money they would receive, enough to start over somewhere better, somewhere worthy of their ambitions. The mistress seemed satisfied with this answer, and Elena heard the unmistakable sound of kissing, intimate and passionate, happening in her living room while she stood trembling in the darkness above. The silver-haired man cleared his throat, apparently uncomfortable with or impatient about the public display of affection, and brought the conversation back to practical matters. He needed to confirm the delivery location, the exact time, and the condition in which Elena would be presented. Marcus provided an address that Elena didn't recognize, somewhere in the industrial district on the far side of the city, and specified 11 o'clock the following night. The man asked if sedation would be necessary, and Marcus assured him it wouldn't be, that he would tell Elena they were going to a special dinner to celebrate the pregnancy, that she would come willingly and suspect nothing until it was too late. The casual way he described his planned deception made Elena realize she had never truly known this man at all, that the person she had loved and married was either a complete fabrication or had been destroyed by greed and ambition so thoroughly that nothing remained of his former self. She heard movement then, the sound of people preparing to leave, and she quickly retreated deeper into the bedroom, her heart hammering so hard she was certain they would hear it even from downstairs. The front door opened and closed, voices faded into the night, and then there was silence except for Marcus's footsteps moving through the house. Elena heard him in the kitchen, heard the clink of glass and the pour of liquid, imagined him pouring himself a celebratory drink while she stood paralyzed with terror just one floor above. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab her half-packed bag and escape through the bedroom window, to disappear into the rainy night and never look back. But her body wouldn't respond, frozen by a combination of shock and disbelief so complete that she felt disconnected from physical reality, as though she were watching this happen to someone else from a great distance. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Elena had lost all sense of time before she heard Marcus climbing the stairs. His footsteps were slow and slightly unsteady, suggesting he had drunk more than one glass of whatever he had poured himself. Elena moved quickly to the bed and arranged herself under the covers, facing away from the door, forcing her breathing to slow into the rhythm of sleep. She heard him pause in the doorway, felt his eyes on her back, and had to fight every muscle in her body to remain still and relaxed. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, and Elena wondered if he somehow knew she had been listening, if her fear had left some detectable trace in the air. But then he moved away, his footsteps receding back down the hall to the guest room, and she was alone again with her racing thoughts and her baby moving restlessly inside her. Elena waited until the house fell completely silent, until even the creaking of old pipes and settling floorboards ceased their nocturnal conversation, before she allowed herself to move. The red numbers on the bedside clock read 3:47 in the morning, that dark hollow hour when the world feels most abandoned and hope most fragile. She slid out of bed with infinite care, every movement calculated to avoid the spots on the floor she knew would groan under pressure. Her body felt strange, disconnected, as though the shock of the past few hours had severed some vital link between her mind and physical form. She finished packing the backpack with methodical precision, including the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left her, documents she might need, the small amount of cash she kept hidden in a tampon box at the back of the bathroom cabinet. These were the salvageable pieces of a life that had already ended, relics she was carrying into an uncertain future. Before leaving the bedroom, Elena paused at the dresser and looked at the framed photograph that sat there, the one from their wedding day. In the picture, she and Marcus were laughing, caught in a moment of pure joy that the camera had preserved but that now felt like archaeological evidence of an extinct civilization. She studied Marcus's face in the photograph, searching for some hint of the monster he would become, some shadow or tell that might have warned her if she had been wise enough to notice. But there was nothing, just a young man who appeared to be genuinely, completely happy. Either he had been an extraordinary actor even then, or something had fundamentally broken inside him in the years since. Elena picked up the frame, held it for a moment, then deliberately placed it face down on the dresser. She would not carry his image with her into whatever came next. She would not allow him even that small piece of real estate in her new life. The stairs presented a challenge she had not fully considered until she stood at the top of them, staring down into the darkness of the first floor. Each step was a potential betrayal, a squeak or groan that might wake Marcus and end her escape before it began. Elena removed her shoes and descended in her socks, keeping her weight close to the wall where the boards were better supported and less likely to protest. Her left hand gripped the railing while her right remained protectively curved around her belly, as though she could shield her unborn child through sheer force of will. Halfway down, one of the steps let out a soft creak that sounded like a gunshot in the silence, and Elena froze, her heart slamming against her ribs so violently she thought it might wake the entire neighborhood. She stood motionless for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of movement from the guest room, but the house remained quiet. When she finally reached the bottom of the stairs, her legs were shaking so badly she had to lean against the wall for support. The front door was locked from the inside with a deadbolt that required a key, a security measure Marcus had insisted on installing 6 months ago. At the time, he had cited rising crime rates in the area, a concern for their safety. Now Elena understood it had been one more brick in the prison he was constructing around her. She moved through the dark house like a ghost, checking windows, searching for an exit that wouldn't trigger the alarm system Marcus had also recently installed. The back door leading to the small patio had a simpler lock, one that could be opened from the inside without a key, but it was connected to the alarm. Elena stood before it, weighing her options. If she opened it, she would have 60 seconds to get clear of the property before the alarm sounded. 60 seconds while 7 months pregnant in the rain with nowhere specific to go. The odds were not favorable, but they were the only odds she had. She placed her hand on the doorknob, took a deep breath, and then stopped. Something had caught her eye, a folder lying on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there when she went to bed. The silver-haired man must have left it during his visit. Elena knew she should leave, that every second she remained in this house was a second closer to disaster, but curiosity and a desperate need to understand what she was running from drew her across the kitchen. She opened the folder with trembling fingers and found herself staring at documents that made her blood run cold. There were contracts, legal papers written in dense language she couldn't fully comprehend but whose general meaning was horrifyingly clear. Her name appeared throughout, alongside terms like transfer of custody and relinquishment of parental rights and payment upon delivery. There were medical records, her medical records from the hospital where she had worked, detailing every aspect of her pregnancy. Someone had been tracking her health, documenting her condition like she was livestock being prepared for sale. Beneath the contracts was a photograph, and Elena's hands began to shake so violently she nearly dropped it. The picture showed a large estate somewhere tropical, surrounded by high walls and lush gardens, isolated and remote. On the back, someone had written an address in the Cayman Islands and a single word that made Elena's stomach turn: compound. This was where they planned to take her, some private island prison from which escape would be virtually impossible. She thought of the anonymous message on her phone, the warning about the transaction, and realized with sick certainty that whoever had sent it knew about this place, had perhaps been there themselves or knew someone who had. This wasn't just about selling her to a wealthy man for money. This was about making her disappear completely, erasing her from existence so thoroughly that no one would ever find her or even know to look. Elena's vision blurred as she stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Marcus had planned. This wasn't a simple transaction or even a straightforward kidnapping. This was premeditated erasure, the systematic dismantling of her entire existence. She would be taken to that compound, held there until she gave birth, and then what? The documents said nothing about her fate after delivery, which was perhaps the most terrifying detail of all. The omission suggested that her survival beyond that point was either irrelevant or actively undesired. Her baby would be taken, raised by strangers in some foreign country, and she would either be disposed of or kept as some kind of prisoner. The horror of it threatened to overwhelm her completely, to drag her down into a paralysis from which she might never emerge. But then the baby kicked, a strong, insistent movement that reminded her she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She forced herself to photograph the documents with her phone, her hands steadying as purpose replaced panic. If she survived this, if she somehow found a way out, she would need evidence. The pictures were blurry, her hands still shaking despite her best efforts, but they were legible enough to prove what Marcus had done. She photographed everything: the contracts, the medical records, the picture of the compound, even a page that appeared to be a financial breakdown showing the amount Marcus would receive upon successful delivery. The number made her gasp: $5 million. He had sold her and their unborn child for $5 million. The mistress was expensive, apparently, with tastes that required that kind of capital to satisfy. Elena thought about the years she had worked herself to exhaustion to support his dreams, the sacrifices she had made, the love she had given freely and without reservation, and realized it had all been worthless to him, less valuable than the money he could get by destroying her. She returned the documents to the folder, arranging them exactly as she had found them, and moved back toward the door. But as her hand touched the knob again, she heard a sound that turned her insides to liquid terror. Footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, coming down. Marcus was awake. Elena looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the kitchen was open and exposed, offering no concealment. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, and Elena knew with absolute certainty that he was listening, trying to determine if he was alone. She pressed herself against the wall beside the refrigerator, barely breathing, her backpack clutched against her chest. The kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight coming through the window above the sink, and she prayed that would be enough to hide her. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the dim light from the hallway. He stood there for a long moment, and Elena could feel his eyes scanning the room even though she couldn't see his face clearly. Then he moved to the counter where the folder lay, picked it up, and flipped through it quickly as though checking that everything was still there. Apparently satisfied, he set it back down and turned toward the refrigerator. Elena's breath caught in her throat as he moved directly toward her hiding spot, her entire body tensed for discovery. But at the last second he changed direction and moved to the sink instead, filling a glass with water. She watched him drink, watched his throat work as he swallowed, and had to fight the urge to run screaming from the house. He was so close she could hear his breathing, could smell the whiskey still on his breath from his earlier celebration. When he finally turned and walked back upstairs, Elena remained frozen for several more minutes, waiting to ensure he wasn't coming back. Her legs had gone numb from standing so still, and when she finally moved, pins and needles shot through them with such intensity she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. She knew she couldn't wait any longer, that her window for escape was closing rapidly. Dawn would come in a few hours, and with it Marcus would wake and begin preparations for the evening's transaction. She had to be gone before then, had to put as much distance as possible between herself and this house of horrors. Elena opened the back door as quietly as she could, and the moment the seal broke, the alarm began its 60-second countdown, a soft beeping that would escalate into a full siren if not disarmed. She ran, her pregnant body protested every step, her center of gravity all wrong, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she ran anyway. The rain had started again, cold and penetrating, soaking through her clothes within seconds. Behind her, she heard the alarm reach its crescendo, a wailing shriek that shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Lights began turning on in neighboring houses, but Elena didn't look back. She reached the street and turned left, heading toward the main road where she might find a taxi or a bus or anything that could carry her away from this nightmare. Her backpack bounced against her spine, and her baby seemed to be moving constantly now, disturbed by the adrenaline flooding her system. Elena's lungs burned and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but she kept moving, driven by a primal survival instinct that overrode every physical complaint her body registered. She made it 3 blocks before her body forced her to stop, doubling over beside a closed convenience store as her lungs screamed for air and a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. The baby was protesting the sudden exertion, or perhaps something worse was happening, something Elena's nursing training recognized as potentially dangerous. She leaned against the wet brick wall, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was crying, and tried to assess whether she was experiencing normal pregnancy discomfort or the early signs of preterm labor. The pain subsided after a few moments, and she took that as permission to keep moving, though at a slower pace now, one hand pressed against her belly as though she could hold everything together through sheer determination. The streets were still empty, that eerie urban silence that exists only in the hours before dawn, and Elena realized with mounting desperation that finding transportation at this hour would be nearly impossible. She walked for another 10 minutes, her clothes heavy with rain, her hair plastered to her skull, before she saw the glow of an all-night diner on the corner ahead. The sight of it nearly made her weep with relief. Inside would be warmth, light, people, witnesses who would make it harder for Marcus to simply drag her back home if he found her. Elena pushed through the door and a small bell chimed overhead, announcing her arrival. The few customers scattered throughout the vinyl booths looked up briefly, took in her bedraggled appearance with varying degrees of concern and disinterest, then returned to their coffee and late-night solitude. A waitress behind the counter, an older woman with kind eyes and grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, immediately grabbed a towel and hurried over. She guided Elena to a booth near the back, wrapped the towel around her shoulders, and asked if she needed her to call someone, the police perhaps, or an ambulance. Elena shook her head, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. She managed to request coffee decaf because of the pregnancy, and the waitress returned moments later with a steaming mug and a sympathetic expression that suggested she had seen this kind of desperation before and understood more than Elena had said. The warmth of the mug between her palms was almost painful after the cold of the rain, but Elena held on anyway, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. She needed to think, to plan, to figure out what came next, but her mind felt sluggish and unfocused, overwhelmed by exhaustion and trauma. The only clear thought that emerged from the chaos was that she couldn't stay in this city, couldn't remain anywhere Marcus might think to look for her. She needed to disappear completely, to become someone else, to erase herself as thoroughly as he had planned to erase her. The bell over the door chimed again, and Elena's head snapped up, her heart lurching with terror. But it was just a young couple, clearly returning from a night out, laughing and holding hands with the easy intimacy of people who had no idea how quickly love could turn to poison. Elena watched them settle into a booth across the diner, watched the man kiss the woman's hand with tenderness that seemed almost obscene in its innocence, and felt something hard and bitter crystallize in her chest. She had been that naive once, had believed in forever and partnership and all the pretty lies people told themselves about marriage. Never again. If she survived this, if she somehow found a way to build a new life, she would never again be so foolish as to trust another person with her survival. The world had revealed itself to be far more cruel than she had imagined, and the lesson had been carved into her soul with a blade she would never forget. She pulled out her phone and stared at the anonymous message again, reading it for perhaps the 100th time since receiving it. Whoever had sent this warning knew details about Marcus's plan, which meant they were close to the situation, possibly even involved. The risk they had taken in reaching out suggested they possessed at least a shred of conscience, which was more than could be said for her husband or his accomplices. Elena made a decision that probably qualified as insane but felt like her only real option. She typed out a response, her thumb hovering over the send button for a long moment before she found the courage to press it. The message was simple and desperate. "I ran, I have nowhere to go, please help me." She watched the message show as delivered, then as read, and held her breath waiting for a response that might never come. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and Elena began to accept that her gamble had failed. Whoever had sent the warning had clearly decided that providing information was one thing, but actively assisting an escape was too dangerous. She couldn't blame them, really. Anyone willing to sell a pregnant woman to a billionaire was capable of almost anything, and getting caught helping their merchandise escape would likely result in severe consequences. Elena was about to put her phone away when it buzzed in her hand, making her jump so violently she nearly dropped it. The response was brief and cryptic. "Bus station, locker 247, code 8359, passport and cash. Get far away and never use your real name again. Burn the phone after this." The message appeared for only a few seconds before it vanished completely, some kind of self-destructing feature that left no trace of the conversation. Elena stared at the blank screen, her mind racing. The bus station was 6 blocks from here, walkable even in her condition. But how did this person know she would run tonight? Had they been watching the house? And why were they helping her at all? The questions multiplied like bacteria, but Elena forced them aside. She didn't have the luxury of understanding motivations right now. Someone had thrown her a lifeline and she needed to grab it before it disappeared. She finished her coffee, left a $20 bill on the table despite the waitress's protests that it was too much, and stepped back out into the rain. The bus station emerged from the grey pre-dawn mist like a monument to transience, its harsh fluorescent lights spilling out onto rain-slicked pavement where a handful of travelers waited with the defeated posture of people who had run out of better options. Elena joined them, just another anonymous figure seeking escape or beginning, or perhaps simply distance from whatever they were leaving behind. Inside, the station smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and the particular desperation that clings to places designed for departure. She moved through the sparse crowd with her head down, hyper-aware of every security camera, every face that might recognize her or remember her later when Marcus inevitably came looking. The lockers lined the far wall, numbered in peeling yellow paint, and Elena found 247 near the bottom row, forcing her to kneel awkwardly with her pregnant belly, making the position almost impossible to hold. Her fingers trembled as she entered the code, and for one terrible moment she thought it wouldn't work, that this had all been some cruel trick or test. But the lock clicked open, and inside she found a thick manila envelope that felt heavy with promise and terror in equal measure. She didn't open it there, couldn't risk revealing its contents in such a public space, so she shoved it into her backpack and made her way to the ticket counter. The agent behind the scratched plexiglass barrier looked up at her with eyes that had seen too many desperate people to register much interest in one more. Elena asked about buses heading south, anywhere south, the farthest destination available. The agent rattled off cities and departure times in a monotone that suggested this speech had been delivered 10,000 times before, and Elena selected one almost at random: Miami. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she had only read in books. The bus would leave in 40 minutes, and the ticket cost $73. In the bathroom, Elena locked herself in the furthest stall and finally opened the envelope. Inside was more money than she had ever seen outside of a bank, neat stacks of $100 bills that added up to what she guessed was at least $30,000. There was also a passport, Canadian, with her photograph but a completely different name: Rebecca Rousseau. The workmanship was flawless, and Elena realized with creeping horror that this wasn't something that could be assembled overnight. Whoever had helped her had been planning this escape route for days, maybe weeks, which raised questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Had they been planning to use it themselves? Or had they always intended it for her, watching and waiting for the moment she would finally understand what danger she was in? There was a handwritten note tucked beneath the passport, just 3 lines in careful script. They will look for Elena Martinez. Let her die tonight. Rebecca Rousseau has no history, no connections, no past. Make sure she has a future. Elena read the note 3 times before the full implication settled over her like a burial shroud. This wasn't just about escaping Marcus or avoiding the transaction. This was about permanent disappearance, about becoming a ghost. Elena Martinez, the woman who had believed in love and partnership and happy endings, needed to cease to exist entirely. Only then would she be truly safe, truly free. She thought about the life she was leaving behind, the friends who would wonder what happened to her, the patients at the hospital who might ask about the pregnant nurse who had always remembered their names. But the truth was that life had already been stripped away from her piece by piece over the past months. Marcus had methodically isolated her until there was almost nothing left to lose except her actual existence. Maybe this unknown benefactor was right. Maybe the only way forward was through complete erasure. She took out her phone and stared at it for a long moment, thinking about all the memories stored there, all the evidence of who she had been. Then she removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and dropped both pieces into the toilet, flushing them away. She would abandon the phone itself in a trash can outside the station, just one more piece of Elena Martinez left behind like breadcrumbs marking a trail that would lead nowhere. When she emerged from the bathroom, she felt strange, untethered, as though she were floating slightly above her own body and watching a stranger navigate through the world. Rebecca Rousseau bought a bottle of water and a sandwich she had no appetite for. Rebecca Rousseau boarded the bus heading south with a backpack and a new passport and a future that was terrifyingly blank. Rebecca Rousseau took a window seat near the back and watched the city where Elena Martinez had lived and loved, and nearly died begin to recede into the distance as the bus pulled out of the station just as dawn broke over the horizon. The landscape transformed as hours passed, urban sprawl giving way to smaller towns and then to open highway lined with pine forests and periodic rest stops. Rebecca, she had to start thinking of herself as Rebecca, watched it all with glassy detachment, her hand resting on her belly where the baby continued its restless movement. She wondered what Marcus had done when he discovered she was gone, whether he had panicked or raged or simply called the silver-haired man to explain that the merchandise had escaped. She wondered if he would look for her, if he would involve the police, or if that would risk exposing his own crimes. Probably the latter, she decided. Men like Marcus didn't seek official help when their illegal transactions fell apart. They handled problems quietly, through channels that operated in shadows and asked no uncomfortable questions. Which meant she needed to stay in those shadows too, needed to become invisible in a way she had never imagined necessary. 6 years, she told herself as the bus carried her toward an uncertain future. 6 years to build a new life, to raise her child in safety, to become strong enough that she would never again be vulnerable to men like Marcus. 6 years to gather evidence, to document what had been done to her, to prepare for a reckoning. Because this wasn't over, not really. Elena Martinez might die tonight, but Rebecca Rousseau would remember everything. And one day, when the time was right, she would return to destroy the man who had tried to erase her. One day, Marcus would understand what it meant to lose everything. One day, she would watch him beg in the streets for mercy she had no intention of granting. The thought settled into her bones like a promise, like an oath, like the first foundation stone of whatever person she was going to become. The rain began again as the bus crossed the state line, and Rebecca closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the road carry her toward whatever came next.